Hello, Internet. Quick behind the scenes, sometimes those hellos sound weird because I'm using it as a mic test, but if it comes through, it comes through. Who cares? Anyways, you'll see from the package behind me, I just got some mail, which for me means comics 9 times out of 10, unless it's bills or whatever. But most of my bills I get digitally. Hooray. So I actually have had this though for a while. The Man Without Fear, and I just reread it tonight because I'm planning on reading a lot more Daredevil soonish. I'm in the middle of reading a lot of X stuff, and I'm kind of in the middle of X Force, and I don't want to just stop. But I also got a buttload of Fantastic Four I want to read. I just read a lot of Silver Surfer, but I also have been on Daredevil. And Daredevil is a character I've been meaning to dig into more, and I've been acquiring. I have another package coming in, but pretty solidly there. There's going to be a few holes, but I'll have issues back to 100 something ish, and then I'll have most of the volume one stuff, and then after that, it's pretty solid. And now most of the miniseries, which is what came in. But I thought before reading any of that, I should reread this because my memory was basically nil. Though I do remember parts. The Man Without Fear is a weird book, and I always thought it was odd that people don't speak about this one too much, I'd say. I mean, if you start talking Daredevil, it'll come up, but as far as like great works or even great works of Frank Miller, it's glossed over. Even if people talk about his Daredevil run, it's not always brought up. So it's not beloved by any stretch, especially considering the pedigree it's coming from. I mean, Frank Miller is the man who made Daredevil. He obviously didn't create Daredevil, but his run transformed the character forever, and every other run kind of has to answer something about the Frank Miller run in some way or another, since it seems, I don't know that for a fact because I haven't read it all. I'm working on it. But I feel like Kevin Smith's run was very informed by Bendis's, Brubaker's, Wade's was very much a reaction that Daredevil hadn't been kind of more happier go lucky since. And then I haven't gotten to Soul or Zdarsky's run. But you just can't escape Frank Miller with Daredevil. And him going and doing a year one with it seems like it would have made more impact. And reading it tonight, I kind of see why it doesn't jive as well. This does go back, and this does kind of insert a lot of what Frank Miller brought to the table with Daredevil. There's Stick, there's Elektra. Foggy is there, but outside of a few kind of like key moments where Foggy was kind of in the background, maybe saying a thing or two, he's not really part of the story. The Kingpin is present, weirdly, but they don't interact directly. So there's that. But what happens is during Matt's development, we get a lot of development from his father, and that becomes a much more gritty crime noir than it was before, certainly, right? And that's the sort of thing where I think this book, should have dug in and should have done, and much what you'd expect, really. If you don't know, Matt's father, Battling Jack Murdoch, was a boxer who was getting to a thing where he's taking dives, and that's kind of more the classical story. This makes it so that he wasn't just taking dives, but he was an enforcer for this mob boss, and shaking people down and doing a lot of stuff he didn't like, which influenced how that worked. But then from there, Frank Miller turns that up a notch, and there's a bit of domestic abuse when Matt hits a kid at school because he wants to take it after dad a bit. His dad hits him to be like, you don't hit other people, which is, interesting. And I've seen people point to that and be like, well, that's toxic masculinity. And it's like, yes. But But if you read that in the comic, it's meant to be confused and tortured, and the dad feels like is literally like the next bit is Matt saying like what dad did was bad, you know, and like everybody recognizes that was the wrong thing to do, and even the dad feels terrible about it. There's not really a reckoning about it, but they seem to be okay with each other after. So I don't know. It doesn't make their relationship feel strained, which is it's a weird thing, and it's the sort of thing that like fits in like a Sin City comic, I guess. But it's just weird here because I think when you strip that much nobility from Matt's dad, like being put in a bad position, then having to like threaten other people to shake them down for money because the small boss, because otherwise they'll kill Matt. Like that level, like there's something there. He's defending his family awkwardly, but to then because there's nothing in this like he hit Matt because Matt did something he didn't want. That I don't know. It just didn't work, and then there was no repercussions later in the book. Just in the page after, there was I don't know. There's just weird moments like that. There's another weird moment where as Matt's like kind of in his it's kind of what they use for the Netflix thing, right? But there's one that they definitely use for Netflix, the proto like black costume, just black clothes and sneakers. That's in issue 5, which is the final issue of The Man Without Fear. Before that, it's kind of like building to that even, when Matt's actually younger and dealing with the crime boss that took down his dad. In the process of that, there's this whorehouse that he stumbles into, and all of them like attack him, and then he accidentally kicks one out the window and she dies, which makes him a murderer, but that's accidental. And then he starts chasing down the guy who killed his dad with the intent of full revenge, which makes sense, but the guy has a heart attack, being so afraid before Matt can actually finally get to him, even though he's facing him down, which is gray area, I guess. But then later in this book, Matt kills someone who's threatening the life of this child he knows who kidnapped the small child, and that's kind of where the book ends. But that makes it so that Matt Murdock going into being Daredevil is a murderer, Punisher style, you know, which is weird because that goes against the morality that even Frank Miller was a part of creating in his early run, where you have that famous Daredevil Punisher story where you're again dealing with kids who are kidnapped, and Daredevil basically says you can't just go around murdering. That's not justice, which is a line that holds with Daredevil, like that tight line of it with him being a lawyer. The whole idea of him being a lawyer here doesn't it's present throughout the book, but it's in the background. It's not really in the foreground as much, which I find frustrating more so. I feel like building up being a lawyer, getting to pass the bar when you're coming out of poverty, basically, is more of a story, more of a climb, especially as a blind student. And the idea of Braille back then. I mean, these were published in 93, 94, kind of assuming past from then. So it's weird, the way they go about it. There's some cool stuff though. All the covers have these like foil bits to them, and despite it being Frank Miller, it's actually drawn by John Romita Jr., who puts on his best Frank Miller here. It's actually interesting because I think John Romita Jr. is known for kind of having had different styles throughout his career, and I think this book helped push him to kind of the more blocky style that he was known for later, that a lot of people don't necessarily like. I do, but here not only is it a bit more blocky, but it's also coupled with something I've seen in a number of Frank Miller comics and also a handful of Ninja Turtle comics, clearly when they're trying to ape Frank Miller in a way, which is just this stack of lines on top of each other within the shape. It's an interesting idea, and it kind of portrays this kind of like outline feel. It's an interesting texture. I haven't seen too much. I'm sure there's a name for it, but I don't know what it is. It's an interesting book. I mean, this book is beautifully done. The craft behind the story, you know, as far as storytelling through comics, is really there. It's very set. You're not getting a lot of Will Eisner-esque pages by any means, but it is this very rigid, like, you know, this panel's here, this panel's here, and it goes beyond like a storyboard idea. Like, it's comics, but it's very fixed in a way that's very making sure each panel hits something, and is playing with angles in an interesting way. And I just really appreciated that in this book, and it made it so easy to lock in, and the writing so perfunctory. You know, it's almost like copywriting. Like, it's sentence fragments and it's little snippets, and a lot of it's in captions and whatnot. And so it's just very there. It's a really gritty, cool crime noir story. It's just when you set it against with who Daredevil's supposed to be, this doesn't feel like a lead up to the character that we know, especially as a starting off and leaping off point. So I don't know. Interesting but flawed. I I think it was right of me to reread this before diving into more Daredevil, and I'm hoping to do some more relatively quick videos about a number of Daredevil minis. So, huzzah.